Transcript: An elderly black man enters a luxury store, searching for the ideal gift for his granddaughter, but the staff ridicule and dismiss him, assuming he can't afford anything. Little do they know, the man they belittle harbors a secret that will dismantle their assumptions and alter everything. Before we continue, who's the most fascinating person you've ever met? I'd love to hear the tale. The soft chime of the glass doors resonated as Thomas Price stepped into the store, his worn shoes tapping gently on the marble floor. Glossy shelves filled with watches, handbags, and jewelry sparkled under the soft ambient lighting. The faint scent of polished leather and high-end cologne lingered in the air. Everything in the store exuded luxury. Thomas, in his old yet well-maintained coat and weathered fedora, seemed out of place, but he wasn't there to blend in. He had come to find the perfect gift, something special for his granddaughter's college graduation, a moment worth celebrating, and for that, only the right watch would suffice. He stood quietly in front of a display case, admiring the silver timepieces inside. One particular watch drew his attention, a sleek silver face with a soft leather strap, understated yet timeless. It reminded him of his granddaughter's quiet strength and grace. Looking around, Thomas hoped for assistance. Across the room, several sales associates stood chatting. Rebecca, a young associate in a sharp blazer, glanced in his direction but made no effort to move. Thomas, ever patient, approached the counter. "Excuse me," he said kindly. "I'd like to see one of the watches in the case over there." Rebecca gave him a cursory glance, her expression cool. The man before her didn't fit the image of a typical customer. His coat worn, shoes scuffed. "Are you sure?" she asked flatly. "Yes. The ones in that case are rather expensive." Thomas offered her a small smile. "Yes, I'm sure. I'd still like to see one." Rebecca hesitated, then smirked slightly, as if sharing an unspoken joke with her colleagues. "The watches start at $1,200, she said, her tone testing him. Without missing a beat, Thomas nodded. "That's fine." Surprised by his calm response, Rebecca unlocked the case with an air of reluctance. She pulled out the watch and set it on the counter carelessly. "Here you go." Thomas picked it up gently, his fingertips brushing the soft leather band. The watch was perfect, just as he had envisioned. "I'll take it," he said, his voice steady. Rebecca blinked. "You want to buy it?" "Yes," Thomas replied with a polite nod. "Please wrap it nicely. It's a gift." Rebecca stood still for a moment, struggling to hide her disbelief. She forced a tight-lipped smile. "Sure, if you say so." While she wrapped the watch, Thomas noticed a couple nearby whispering. They cast amused glances in his direction. "Must be lost," one of them muttered with a chuckle. "What's he doing in here?" Thomas heard the words but didn't react. He had faced assumptions like these all his life. The sting never faded, but he had learned not to let it define him. Rebecca slid the neatly wrapped box across the counter. "Good luck with that," she said with a forced smile. Thomas tucked the box under his arm and gave a small nod. "Thank you." As he turned and made his way toward the exit, the familiar weight of judgment trailed behind him. But he wasn't concerned. His steps were steady, and his smile, though subtle, carried a quiet strength. This wasn't just about a watch. There was a lesson yet to unfold, and soon the people inside that store would realize not everything is as it seems. Thomas lingered by the display case for a moment longer, savoring the satisfaction of having found the perfect gift. Just as he adjusted his hat, the faint sound of laughter drifted from the counter. Rebecca had returned to her colleagues, her voice low but audible. "He's still looking at the watches," she whispered with a laugh. "Must think he's at a thrift shop." The others chuckled in agreement. To them, Thomas's presence was a joke, a harmless oddity in a store meant for wealthier clientele. Thomas took a slow breath, steadying himself. He was used to moments like these, yet today felt different. Today he was not just passing through. He was here with purpose. Gathering his composure, Thomas walked back to the counter. Rebecca noticed him approach and exchanged an amused glance with her colleagues. Her smile was thin, the kind reserved for someone you hope will leave soon. "Decide on anything?" she asked, her voice dripping with disinterest. "Yes," Thomas said with a polite nod. "I'd like the silver watch with the leather band, please." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "That one?" It's from the designer collection, $1,200. I know, Thomas replied calmly. That's the one I want. Rebecca's fingers hovered over the display case keys, her hesitation palpable. Her expression said it all. She didn't believe, not for a second, that Thomas could afford it. Are you sure? She asked, her tone condescending. We've got some lovely options on clearance. I'm sure, Thomas interrupted, his voice firm but polite. Rebecca shrugged as if to say, it's your embarrassment, not mine, and unlocked the display case. She retrieved the watch with obvious reluctance and slid it across the counter. There you go, she said with a touch of sarcasm. Take your time. Thomas picked up the watch, examining it closely. His smile returned as he imagined the joy it would bring his granddaughter. Rebecca crossed her arms and smirked. Want me to wrap it up? Yes. Thomas replied evenly. That would be nice. Before Rebecca could move, a sharp voice cut through the room. Rebecca! Mr. Carter, the store manager, called out. He approached with a furrowed brow, his suit impeccable, and his shoes polished to a shine. What's going on? Mr. Carter asked, glancing between Thomas and Rebecca. Oh, nothing, Rebecca said with a smirk. This gentleman wanted to see one of the designer watches. Mr. Carter's gaze drifted over Thomas, his expression tight. Did you inform him of the price? Yes, Rebecca said with barely concealed amusement. He still insists on buying it. Thomas met Mr. Carter's gaze, unwavering. I'd like to buy the watch, he said simply. The manager's thin smile held no warmth. Perhaps, he began, you'd be more comfortable shopping elsewhere. The insult hung in the air. Thomas blinked slowly, weighing the words. No, Thomas replied quietly. I think this store will do just fine. Frustration flickered in Mr. Carter's eyes, but he masked it with a forced smile. Rebecca, assist the gentleman. Rebecca rolled her eyes and began wrapping the watch without enthusiasm. If you insist, she muttered. Thomas watched her, his expression calm. Inside, however, a quiet resolve settled. This was more than a purchase. Rebecca slid the box toward Thomas with a smirk. Good luck with that, she said. Thomas tucked the box under his arm, his gaze steady. Thank you, he replied softly, with a small, knowing smile. Thomas turned and headed toward the register, leaving Rebecca and Mr. Carter in awkward silence. They had no idea the revelation that awaited them. Thomas stood at the register, the gift box tucked carefully under his arm, waiting for someone to assist him. The condescending tone of Rebecca and the dismissive attitude of Mr. Carter still lingered in the back of his mind, pressing down like an unwanted weight. But Thomas took a steady breath, reminding himself why he was there. Today wasn't about them. It was about his granddaughter. This watch was meant to celebrate her achievements, and no amount of ignorance would rob him of the joy of giving it to her. He looked around the store, hoping to catch someone's attention at the checkout counter. The young cashier, a woman with brightly colored nails, glanced up briefly but made no move to help. Instead, she busied herself on her phone, tapping away with a dismissive air. Thomas shifted slightly. A calm patience etched into his posture. Years of experience had taught him to endure such moments with grace, though it never became easier. His hand drifted to the list in his pocket, the one with a few ideas for gifts. It was something small, but having it with him kept him grounded. It reminded him that moments like these didn't define him, even when they tried to. Just as he prepared to speak up, another customer breezed past him toward the register, a younger man dressed in designer clothes and exuding confidence, placing his purchases on the counter with an air of entitlement. The cashier, previously disinterested, immediately perked up. "Hello there. Did you find everything okay?" she asked, her tone light and friendly. Thomas watched the interaction without a trace of resentment. He had seen this play out too many times before. The silent judgment. The way people decided your worth before you had the chance to speak. He knew how easy it would be to let anger take root, but he refused to carry that burden. He had learned long ago that dignity was the one thing no one could take from him. When the young man finished his transaction, Thomas stepped forward once more. The cashier glanced at him briefly, her enthusiasm from the previous interaction quickly fading. "Do you need something?" she asked flatly, as if he were an inconvenience. "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "I'd like to pay for this, please." The cashier's gaze flicked to the neatly wrapped box under his arm. She raised an eyebrow. as if questioning why he'd even bother buying something so expensive. But Thomas gave her no room to doubt him. He placed the box gently on the counter and waited with a quiet patience that made her shift uncomfortably. "I see," she muttered, typing into the register. "It's going to be $1,200. Thomas nodded. "That's fine." That. The cashier hesitated, glancing around the store as if expecting someone to intervene. "We only take cards for purchases this large," she added, her voice laced with subtle doubt. "That won't be a problem," Thomas replied smoothly, retrieving his wallet. He handed her a sleek black card, the kind rarely seen except in the hands of the wealthiest clients. The cashier's demeanor changed instantly. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed her face. She looked down at the card, then back up at Thomas, struggling to conceal her embarrassment. Right away, sir," she stammered, suddenly flustered. Thomas watched her swipe the card, his expression calm and composed. He could see the shift in her posture, the subtle change in how she now saw him, as though the card alone had redefined his worth in her eyes. It was the same game, played out in countless ways. But Thomas refused to let it touch him. He simply waited as she printed the receipt and slid the watch box into an elegant shopping bag. "There you go, sir," she said, her tone now filled with forced politeness. "Thank you for shopping with us." Thomas accepted the bag with a small nod. "Thank you," he replied softly, his gaze steady but kind as he turned to leave. Carter appeared once more, hovering near the entrance with an uneasy expression. The manager's earlier confidence seemed to have diminished slightly, perhaps noticing the black card, or perhaps realizing that Thomas was not the simple man he had assumed. "Leaving so soon?" Mr. Carter called out, attempting to sound friendly but failing to hide the awkwardness in his voice. Thomas stopped briefly, adjusting the bag on his arm. "Yes," he said with a polite smile. "I found exactly what I needed." Mr. Carter nodded, though there was a tightness in his expression. It was clear he wanted to say more, but the weight of the moment hung between them, making words feel out of place. Thomas gave him a final glance, one filled with quiet understanding, not anger, and then stepped toward the door. The sharp chime of the glass doors opening marked his exit, and with that, Thomas was gone, leaving the store behind without a backward glance. Outside, the crisp autumn air greeted him, bringing with it a sense of clarity. Thomas took a deep breath, savoring the cool breeze that brushed against his skin. He glanced at the shopping bag in his hand and smiled to himself. The watch inside was more than just a luxury item. It was a promise that his granddaughter's journey would be filled with pride, love, and the kind of perseverance that had brought him to this moment. As he walked down the street, the sounds of the city surrounded him. Cars honking, people chatting, footsteps hurrying along the sidewalk. But Thomas moved at his own pace, unbothered by the rush around him. He passed shop windows filled with bright displays, cafes bustling with life, and parks where children laughed and played. The world went on just as it always did, indifferent to the small victories and quiet struggles that people carried with them. But for Thomas, today was a win, not because of the watch or the card or even the glances that had followed him through the store. It was a win because he had remained true to himself. He had faced disrespect with grace, humiliation with dignity, and judgment with patience. And in doing so, he had kept hold of the one thing that mattered most, his integrity. With a sense of calm settling over him, Thomas adjusted his hat against the breeze and continued on his way. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he would meet them with the same quiet strength that had carried him through all these years. After all, there was still so much to look forward to, starting with the look on his granddaughter's face when she opened her gift. As Thomas walked away from the counter, the subtle sounds of footsteps followed him. He felt their presence before they spoke, the kind of heavy footsteps that carried intention. When he turned, Mr. Carter was just a few paces behind, wearing a tight-lipped smile that seemed more rehearsed than sincere. "Excuse me, sir," Mr. Carter called after him, his tone laced with forced politeness. Thomas stopped, holding the shopping bag loosely at his side. He met the manager's gaze with the same calm he had carried throughout the store, though his expression hinted at mild curiosity. "Yes?" Thomas asked, his voice steady. Mr. Carter approached slowly, his gaze flickering toward the bag as if its contents had only now become real to him. He clasped his hands in front of him, the way a politician might when preparing to smooth over an awkward situation. "I just wanted to ensure everything was satisfactory with your purchase," Mr. Carter said. "You know we aim to provide the best experience for all our customers." The words sounded smooth, but his eyes betrayed the unease behind them. Thomas gave a polite nod. "Everything went fine, thank you," he said, his expression neutral. For a moment, there was silence between them, the kind that felt heavy, as though both men were waiting for the other to say something more. Mr. Carter shifted on his feet, his confidence wavering under the weight of the exchange. "Sir," the manager began again, his tone shifting to one of thinly veiled condescension, "I hope you understand that our staff's intentions were not meant to be personal." He smiled tightly, as if expecting the statement to absolve all that had transpired. "We sometimes encounter situations where, well, people might browse items beyond their budget, and we simply try to assist them by pointing them in the right direction." Thomas blinked slowly, his face betraying none of the emotions swirling beneath the surface. It was a well-worn dance, this attempt to excuse poor behavior with platitudes, and he had heard every variation of it over the years. "I see," Thomas said quietly, allowing the words to hang in the air between them. Mr. Carter mistook his calm response for acceptance and pressed on, emboldened. "You have to understand, it's not always easy to assess every customer's needs at a glance," he added, gesturing vaguely toward Thomas's attire, as if to imply the source of the misunderstanding. Thomas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a point that didn't need to be said aloud. His gaze, however, remained steady, and it unsettled the manager more than any argument might have. "Thank you for explaining," Thomas replied, his tone polite but resolute. "Though I believe the only thing I needed today was assistance, not judgment." Carter's smile faltered. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself grappling for words. There was something in the quiet confidence of the elderly man before him, a sense of self-assuredness that refused to bend under the weight of disrespect. "I assure you," Mr. Carter stammered. There was no intention to offend. "I know," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. "But intentions don't change outcomes, do they?" The manager's mouth snapped shut, caught off guard by the subtle yet profound truth in Thomas's words. For a moment, Carter looked as if he might argue, but then he seemed to think better of it. "I apologize if you felt mistreated," the manager said awkwardly, the words sounding more obligatory than heartfelt. Thomas nodded once. Apology accepted. Just as Mr. Carter shifted uncomfortably, Rebecca reappeared, standing a few steps away with her arms crossed. Her expression was less guarded than her manager's, her disapproval now blatant and unhidden. "We were only doing our job," Rebecca muttered under her breath, though the words were loud enough for Thomas to hear. "We can't help it if people get offended so easily." Mr. Carter shot her a sharp look, silently pleading with her to stop. But Rebecca wasn't finished. Emboldened by the lingering tension, she added with a sneer, "You'd think some people would have thicker skin." Thomas regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his gaze, no hint of malice, only a quiet sadness, a reflection of the countless times he had faced such disdain, disguised as professionalism. He adjusted the brim of his hat, taking a step closer to Rebecca, until there was only a small distance between them. "Young lady," he began softly, "thick skin can't protect a person from being treated unfairly." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. But Thomas's gaze remained steady. "And one day you'll learn that what really defines us," he continued, "is how we treat others, especially when we think no one's watching." Rebecca scoffed, rolling her eyes, but something in her demeanor shifted just slightly. A flicker of discomfort passed across her face, as if the weight of Thomas's words had settled somewhere deep within her, even if she didn't want to admit it. "Mr. Carter cleared his throat, eager to end the interaction. "Well, sir," he said, forcing another strained smile, "thank you for your understanding. I hope you'll give us another chance to serve you in the future." Thomas gave him a small, polite smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll think about it," he said, his tone calm and measured. With that, Thomas turned away, walking toward the door with slow, deliberate steps. The shopping bag swayed gently at his side, a quiet reminder of the gift he had come to purchase and the respect he had chosen to carry with him, even when others refused to offer it. As the glass doors slid open with a soft chime, Thomas stepped out into the bright afternoon light. The cool breeze greeted him once again, brushing against his skin like gentle reassurance. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, inhaling the fresh air as if cleansing himself of the store's lingering bitterness. Behind him, Mr. Carter and Rebecca stood frozen, watching the elderly man with a mix of confusion and unease. There was something about him, something they couldn't quite place, that left them unsettled, and though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew deep down that this encounter wasn't over. Not yet. Thomas stepped onto the bustling street, the cool breeze offering a brief sense of relief. Yet as he continued walking, his thoughts lingered on what had just happened inside the store. He wasn't a man easily rattled. Life had thrown much worse at him, and he'd always prided himself on meeting every challenge with grace. But there was something different about this encounter, something that gnawed at him. He clutched the shopping bag tighter, the smooth material cool against his palm. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, not because of the watch inside, but because of what the interaction represented. This wasn't just a gift for his granddaughter. It was supposed to mark a celebration of progress, of hope, of overcoming obstacles. And yet, in that store, he had been reminded once again of how easily people could judge a man by his appearance. Thomas slowed his pace as he reached the corner of the block, his footsteps becoming more deliberate. He stopped near a bench, setting the bag down beside him with a sigh. It had been years, decades, since he'd let anything get under his skin like this. He thought he'd grown immune to the small indignities, the dismissive glances, the assumptions. But today it felt different. He sat quietly for a moment, watching the world pass by. Couples strolled hand in hand, children chased pigeons across the pavement, and business people hurried past with phones pressed to their ears. Life continued, indifferent to the frustrations he carried within him. Thomas's fingers drummed softly on the handle of the bag as his mind drifted. A memory from long ago surfaced, one he hadn't thought of in years. He saw himself as a young man just starting out in business. The world had been just as dismissive back then, if not more so. People wouldn't take him seriously. Investors had turned him down with polite smiles that never reached their eyes. Customers had walked away from him without a second glance. And through it all, he had pressed on, determined to build something that no one could take away from him. The memory brought a small, bittersweet smile to his lips. He had proven them all wrong in the end. The company he built from the ground up had become a symbol of resilience, his silent victory over every door that had been shut in his face. He thought of that now as he sat on the bench, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. The man inside that store, the one who had judged him, dismissed him, made him feel small, didn't know who he was, and that Thomas realized was what hurt the most. They hadn't seen him for what he was. Not just an old man in a worn-out coat, but the very person who made it possible for that store to exist. A flicker of something deeper stirred within him, something he had buried long ago. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was more like disappointment, mixed with a quiet determination that had never truly left him. Thomas sat up straighter, his hands resting on his knees. He couldn't let this go. Not this time. Not when it represented everything he had worked for, everything he had taught his children and grandchildren about, standing tall in the face of injustice. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves at his feet. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. It wasn't just about a watch, and it wasn't about teaching the staff inside that store a lesson. This was about reclaiming something for himself, something that shouldn't have been taken from him in the first place. He stood slowly, picking up the shopping bag with deliberate care. His movements were unhurried, but there was a new resolve in the way he carried himself as he made his way back toward the store. His footsteps felt lighter, as if each step was stripping away the burden of the earlier encounter. When he reached the entrance, the glass doors slid open with their familiar chime. Inside, the store was just as busy as before, with customers browsing and sales associates attending to them. But the atmosphere seemed to shift the moment Thomas walked through the door. Rebecca, still stationed behind the counter, glanced up and caught sight of him. Her smirk faded into something closer to disbelief. "He's back," she muttered to the coworker beside her. Mr. Carter noticed him too, straightening his posture with a wary expression. It was clear they hadn't expected to see him again, not after the way they had treated him. Thomas walked toward the counter with the same quiet dignity that had marked his every move. He placed the shopping bag gently on the counter, as though the weight of the watch was no heavier than the moment itself. "I believe we have something to discuss," Thomas said calmly, his gaze steady on Mr. Carter. The manager blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Is there an issue with your purchase, sir?" he asked, his voice overly polite. Thomas smiled faintly. "No issue with the purchase," he replied. "But there is an issue with the way I was treated." Rebecca rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. "Look, if you didn't like the service, you could have just said so," she muttered under her breath. Thomas ignored her, his focus remaining on Mr. Carter. "I want you to know," he continued, "that the assumptions made about me today were not only wrong, but unnecessary." Mr. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Thomas held up a hand, his expression kind but firm. "You see, I've spent a lifetime dealing with people like you. People who think they can tell a man's worth just by looking at him." He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a calm, measured tone. "But what you don't realize is that people like me are the ones who make stores like this possible." Rebecca scoffed, muttering under her breath again. "What's that supposed to mean?" Thomas turned toward her with the same steady gaze. "It means," he said softly, "that when you judge someone by their appearance, you risk disrespecting the very person who built the ground you stand on." Rebecca's face flushed slightly, though she tried to mask it with indifference. Mr. Carter, meanwhile, looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting on his feet as if searching for an escape. Thomas smiled politely. "I own this company," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "Every item in this store, every paycheck you receive, every single part of this operation exists because of the business I built." Silence fell over the store like a heavy curtain. Rebecca's smug expression evaporated, replaced by stunned disbelief. Mr. Carter stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as if trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Thomas adjusted the brim of his hat, giving them both a moment to absorb the truth. Then, with a calm, knowing smile, he picked up the shopping bag once more. "Now," he said quietly, "do you think we can start treating people with the respect they deserve?" Without waiting for a response, Thomas turned and walked toward the door. The glass doors opened smoothly for him as they had before, and he stepped out into the bright afternoon light. But this time, the air felt lighter, the breeze warmer against his skin. He had done what he came to do, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small. And that, Thomas knew, was worth more than any watch in the world owned. The soft chime of the store's glass doors announced Thomas's departure as he stepped out into the bustling street. Yet just as the breeze kissed his face, a voice called after him from inside. "Wait, sir, please, just a moment." Mr. Carter hurried toward the entrance, his face pale and his movements flustered, as if the ground beneath him had shifted and he was desperately trying to steady himself. The store manager caught the door before it closed, panting slightly as he gestured for Thomas to come back inside. Thomas turned, his expression calm but curious, the corners of his lips barely curling into a polite smile. He wasn't surprised by the sudden change in Carter's demeanor. It was a pattern he had seen before, how quickly people tried to backpedal once they realized they had misjudged someone they thought unimportant. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Carter stammered, forcing a nervous chuckle. "You must forgive us. We had no idea who you were." Thomas raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "Is that so?" he asked softly, his voice laced with quiet patience. "And how would you have treated me if you had known?" Mr. Carter swallowed hard, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of the question. He shot a glance toward Rebecca, who stood frozen behind the counter, her smug expression wiped clean. She seemed to shrink under the realization that the man they had belittled was far more powerful than either of them had imagined. Carter stumbled over his words, struggling to craft an explanation. "We didn't mean anything by it, sir. It was just a mistake, an unfortunate misunderstanding." Thomas's expression remained serene, but the slight narrowing of his eyes conveyed a depth of meaning. "Misunderstanding, you say?" he echoed. "And how often do these misunderstandings happen in this store?" Carter's face flushed. "I can assure you, sir, this isn't how we usually operate. We pride ourselves on customer service." He shot another glance toward Rebecca, who stood frozen in place, looking like she wanted to melt into the floor. Thomas's gaze softened. Not in forgiveness, but in understanding. He knew this dance well. People like Carter always scrambled when the veil was lifted, exposing the assumptions and biases they carried beneath their polished exteriors. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim leather business card holder. With a smooth motion, he extracted a single card and held it out between two fingers. Mr. Carter hesitated before taking it, his hands trembling slightly as he read the embossed lettering. "Thomas Price," Carter whispered aloud, his face paling further as the realization sank in. "Founder and CEO." Silence fell like a heavy curtain between them. Carter's breath hitched as he struggled to process what he had just learned. The man they had treated with condescension, the man they had dismissed as irrelevant, was not only the owner of the store, but the architect of the entire company. Rebecca took a step forward, her voice cracking under the weight of her shock. You own this place?" she whispered, as if the words themselves were too incredible to believe. Thomas gave her a polite nod. "Yes," he said simply, "every item in this store, every paycheck you earn, every policy you follow, it all starts with me." Mr. Carter opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, scrambling to recover from the monumental mistake they had just made. "Sir, please understand, we would never have." Thomas held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. His expression remained composed. But there was a quiet power in his gaze, the kind that came from years of experience and hard-won success. "You see," Thomas began, his tone even, "the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that it shouldn't have mattered." Rebecca looked down at her feet, her arms folded tightly across her chest as if to shield herself from the truth. Mr. Carter, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Thomas's words sinking in deeper than any scolding ever could. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze moving between the two of them. "I didn't walk into this store asking for special treatment," he continued. "I only wanted the same courtesy you would offer any other customer. But what I got instead was judgment, dismissal, disrespect." Carter fumbled with the card in his hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're so sorry, Mr. Price. Please believe me. It wasn't intentional." Thomas's eyes softened, though not with forgiveness, at least not yet. "Intentions don't change the outcome," he said quietly, "and the lesson here is simple. Treat everyone with respect, no matter what they look like or where you think they come from." Rebecca cleared her throat, her voice shaky. We really didn't mean anything by it," she mumbled, though it sounded more like an excuse than an apology. Thomas turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "One day," he said softly, "you'll realize that not meaning anything by it isn't enough. Actions leave a mark, whether you intend them to or not." Rebecca blinked rapidly, struggling to hold back tears. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the gravity of what had just happened. Mr. Carter took a deep breath, visibly humbled. "Mr. Price, I don't know how we can make this right, but if there's anything we can do." Thomas offered a small, knowing smile. "You can start by doing better," he said simply, "not just for me, but for every person who walks through these doors." Carter nodded earnestly. "Of course, sir. We'll make sure this never happens again." Thomas adjusted his coat, preparing to leave. "See that you do," he said quietly, "because the next time I visit, I won't be as patient." With those words, he gave them both one final meaningful glance, a look that spoke of both warning and hope, and then turned toward the door. The glass doors slid open with a soft chime, and Thomas stepped out into the sunlight once more. This time, the air felt lighter, as if the burden of the day had lifted from his shoulders. Behind him, Mr. Carter and Rebecca stood frozen in place, watching as the man they had so carelessly dismissed walked away with the quiet dignity they hadn't afforded him earlier. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew that this encounter would linger with them long after Thomas had gone. It was a lesson they wouldn't forget, a reminder that respect should never be reserved for the few, but given freely to all. As Thomas made his way down the street, the shopping bag swinging gently at his side, a small smile played at the corners of his lips. He had come for a watch. But what he left with was something far more valuable, the knowledge that in the end, character always outshines status, and that no matter how the world judged him, he would always walk with his head held high. Thomas continued his steady walk down the sidewalk, the luxury store disappearing behind him. But inside the store, Mr. Carter remained standing, in stunned silence. Rebecca, too, stood frozen by the counter, biting her lip and wringing her hands, the weight of what had just transpired settling over the entire store like a suffocating cloud. Carter took a sharp breath, his mind racing. It was no longer just a personal embarrassment. It was a professional crisis. He had offended the founder and owner of the entire company. If word spread, his job and reputation would be on the line. The humiliation he had tried to avoid by dismissing Thomas now threatened to consume him entirely. "Rebecca," Carter muttered, snapping out of his daze. "Get the corporate office on the phone now." Rebecca swallowed hard. "Are we in trouble?" she asked, her voice small. Carter shot her a hard look. "Trouble? If we don't fix this, we'll be lucky to still have jobs by the end of the week." Rebecca fumbled with her phone, her hands trembling as she tried to dial the number for corporate. Her smug attitude from earlier had dissolved completely, replaced by panic and regret. Meanwhile, Thomas walked steadily, his hands relaxed at his sides, his grip on the shopping bag firm but unhurried. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and with a small sigh, he pulled it out. A familiar name flashed on the screen. Robert, his head of public relations. Thomas answered the call with a quiet hello. Robert, on the other end of the line, had a tense but respectful voice. "Mr. Price, I just received a message from the manager of one of our stores. He says there's been a situation involving you." Thomas smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Situation? Is that what he's calling it?" he mused softly. "Yes, sir," Robert responded carefully. "It sounds like an apology is in order. I've already contacted the regional office. They're drafting a public statement as we speak." Thomas let out a low hum of approval. "Good," he said. "But let's make sure it's more than just words. I want a full review of the store's hiring and training practices. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it certainly won't be the last, unless we do better." "I'll see to it personally," Robert assured him. "And if you'd like, I can arrange a public apology from the manager." Thomas considered the offer for a moment. "Make sure the apology happens," he said quietly. "Not for me, but for the people who will walk into that store tomorrow, the next day, and every day after that." "I understand, sir," Robert replied. Thomas ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. His steps didn't falter as he continued down the street, a quiet resolve settling over him. The watch in the bag was still a gift for his granddaughter, but now it carried even more meaning. A symbol of the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter how subtle or small the injustice. Back at the store, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Mr. Carter hovered near the counter, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke hurriedly with corporate. Rebecca stood nearby, nervously biting her nails. "Sir," Carter said into the phone, "I understand the severity of the situation. We're doing everything we can to make it right. I'll personally apologize to Mr. Price if that's what it takes." He listened intently, nodding to himself, though his face was pale with stress. When he finally ended the call, he turned to Rebecca with a grim expression. "We're issuing a public apology immediately," he said. "The company's reputation depends on it." Rebecca looked down at the floor, shame evident in her posture. "Do you think he'll forgive us?" she whispered. Carter exhaled sharply. "I don't know," he admitted, "but forgiveness isn't what we're owed right now. All we can do is try to be better." Later that evening, the company released an official statement acknowledging the incident and apologizing publicly for the way Thomas had been treated. The statement promised a comprehensive review of policies and pledged to implement changes to ensure no customer was ever judged or mistreated based on appearance. News outlets picked up the story, and it spread quickly across social media. The incident became a viral topic of conversation, with many users applauding Thomas's calm demeanor and calling for accountability in customer service practices across industries. In the days that followed, the luxury store implemented several changes. Employees were required to undergo diversity and inclusion training. New hiring policies were introduced, and every manager across the company was reminded of the importance of treating customers with respect, no matter who they were or how they looked. Rebecca and Mr. Carter weren't fired, but their roles were scrutinized closely. They both received formal reprimands and were assigned mandatory training sessions. More importantly, they were given time to reflect on what they had learned. For Rebecca especially, the experience left a lasting impression, one she would carry with her into every future interaction. A week after the incident, Thomas received a handwritten letter from Mr. Carter. It wasn't long, but it was sincere. In the letter, Carter acknowledged his mistakes and expressed his regret for the way he had treated Thomas. He thanked Thomas for handling the situation with grace and vowed to do better in the future. Thomas read the letter quietly at his kitchen table, a small smile touching his lips. He appreciated the gesture, though he knew that true change wasn't measured by words on paper, but by actions over time. His granddaughter's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Grandpa, are you ready?" Thomas looked up, seeing her standing in the doorway with a bright smile. She was dressed for dinner, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Just a moment," Thomas replied, reaching for the shopping bag beside him. He opened it and retrieved the watch box, handing it to her with a warm smile. "This is for you," he said softly. "A little something to remind you of how proud I am." She opened the box, her eyes widening with delight. "Grandpa, it's beautiful," she whispered, carefully lifting the watch from its velvet lining. Thomas smiled, "Just like you," as she slipped the watch onto her wrist. Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him. The watch wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing tall in the face of adversity, and of never letting the world define your worth. "Ready for dinner?" his granddaughter asked. Her smile radiant. Thomas nodded, rising from his chair. "Let's go," he said warmly, offering her his arm. And as they walked out the door together, Thomas knew that despite the challenges he had faced, he had come out the other side with his dignity intact. The world would continue to throw its judgments and assumptions his way, but he would meet them all with the same quiet strength that had carried him this far, and in the end, that was more than enough. Later that evening, Thomas sat by the large window in his living room, looking out at the night sky. The soft hum of the city outside was barely audible from his quiet, cozy home. The lights from the street below twinkled like tiny stars. But his thoughts were far from the peaceful view. The events of the past week lingered in his mind, replaying in quiet moments like this one. He had faced prejudice before, too many times to count, and while the incident at the store wasn't unique in that sense, it had left a different kind of mark on him. Not because it was more painful or more blatant, but because it came at a time in his life when he thought he'd seen it all, experienced it all. Even now, after all his success, people still felt the need to remind him of their small-minded assumptions. His granddaughter's laughter drifted from the next room, pulling him from his thoughts. She had spent the last hour on the phone with her friends, showing off her new watch and sharing stories about her graduation. Her joy was infectious, and Thomas couldn't help but smile at the sound. She had no idea how much this gift and the journey to get it meant to him. A soft knock on the door pulled Thomas from his thoughts completely. He wasn't expecting visitors this late, but he stood and crossed the room, curious. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see Marcus, one of his neighbors from down the block, standing there with a shy smile and a slight wave. "Evening, Thomas," Marcus said, his voice warm but hesitant. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Thomas shook his head, stepping aside to invite Marcus in. "Not at all. Come in, come in." Marcus entered, rubbing the back of his neck as if unsure of how to start. He and Thomas had known each other for years, often exchanging pleasantries when they crossed paths in the neighborhood. But they'd never had what Thomas would call deep conversation. Yet something in Marcus's demeanor told Thomas that this visit was different. "I heard about what happened," Marcus began, settling into the chair opposite Thomas. "You know, at the store?" Thomas raised an eyebrow, though he wasn't entirely surprised. Word had spread quickly, especially after the public apology. "I suppose news travels fast," he said with a slight smile. Marcus chuckled softly. "It does, especially around here. But I didn't come by just to talk about that. I wanted to say thank you." Thomas tilted his head, a bit confused. "Thank me for what?" Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "For standing up, for not letting them walk all over you, for making sure they knew that what they did wasn't right." Thomas's smile faded into something more thoughtful. He hadn't expected anyone to thank him for what happened at the store. For him, it had been about reclaiming his dignity, not about making a public stand. But hearing Marcus's words, he realized that perhaps his actions had resonated in ways he hadn't anticipated. "You didn't have to do what you did," Marcus continued, his voice filled with quiet admiration. A lot of folks would have just walked away, let them treat you like that, and moved on, but you didn't, and that means something. Thomas sat back, considering Marcus's words carefully. I wasn't trying to make a statement, he admitted. I was just tired of letting people think they could judge me by what I look like, what I wear, what they think they know about me. Marcus nodded, his eyes earnest. That's exactly why it matters. You showed them and everyone else that respect is something we all deserve, no matter what. The room fell into a comfortable silence for a moment as Thomas processed what Marcus had said. He hadn't realized that his quiet stand against prejudice had such an impact on those around him. But now, hearing it from Marcus, it made sense. He had lived a life of dignity, of standing tall despite the challenges, and in doing so, he had become an example for others, whether he intended to or not. I guess I didn't think about it that way, Thomas said softly, his gaze drifting back to the window. I was just doing what felt right, yes. And that's why it mattered, Marcus replied, his voice steady. You showed people that we don't have to accept the way things are. We can demand better. Thomas smiled faintly, a deep sense of warmth spreading through him. He hadn't set out to be anyone's role model, but knowing that his actions had inspired someone else, someone like Marcus, gave him a quiet sense of pride. I'm glad it made a difference, Thomas said finally, his voice low but sincere. But it shouldn't take something like this for people to be treated with respect. Marcus nodded in agreement, his expression thoughtful. You're right, it shouldn't, but sometimes it takes someone like you to remind the world that respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. As the conversation continued, Marcus shared more about how the story of Thomas's encounter at the store had made waves in the community. People had started talking about their own experiences with discrimination, with judgment, with being treated unfairly simply because of how they looked. And Thomas, without even realizing it, had become a beacon of hope for those who had been carrying the weight of those experiences in silence. By the time Marcus left, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident at the store hadn't just been about him. It had been about everyone who had ever been made to feel small. And if his actions could inspire even one person to stand a little taller, to demand the respect they deserved, then it had all been worth it. As he closed the door behind Marcus, Thomas glanced down at his phone. There was a new message from Lafaya. Hey, Grandpa, just wanted to say thank you again for the watch. Every time I look at it, I think of you and everything you've taught me. Love you so much. Thomas smiled, his heart swelling with pride. His granddaughter's words were a reminder of what truly mattered, the legacy he was building, not through wealth or status, but through love, kindness, and resilience. The next morning, as he prepared to meet with a group of young entrepreneurs, Thomas glanced at his reflection in the mirror. He adjusted his hat, the familiar weight of it grounding him in the present. Life would always present challenges, but he knew now more than ever that he had the strength to meet them with grace. Before leaving the house, Thomas took a moment to breathe in the quiet stillness around him. There was a sense of peace in knowing that he had done his part, that he had left the world a little better than he had found it. And as he stepped out into the morning light, his heart was light, his steps steady, and his spirit unwavering. The world would continue to judge, to assume, to misunderstand, but Thomas Price would walk through it all with his head held high, knowing that character, not wealth or appearances, was the true measure of a person's worth, and in the end, that was more than enough. As Thomas walked out of the store that day, the breeze brushing against his face felt lighter. The weight of judgment, assumptions, and disrespect was no stranger to him, but it didn't define him. He had learned long ago that dignity isn't given, it's maintained through grace, no matter the circumstances. The staff inside that store had made the mistake of judging him by his appearance. They saw only what they wanted to see, an old man in a worn coat. What they missed was the man who built the very foundation beneath their feet, a man whose success was measured not by wealth, but by character. Thomas didn't need to raise his voice or demand respect. He let the truth speak for itself. And in the silence that followed his quiet revelation, the message became clear. True worth isn't in appearances, but in how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. This isn't just Thomas's story. It's a reminder to all of us. How often do we make assumptions about others? How often do we judge without knowing the full story? Respect isn't a privilege. It's a choice. What would you have done in Thomas's shoes? Have you ever experienced a moment like this? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button for more powerful, real-life stories.